maybe we'll dive a bit deeper with you, Tom. You cite multiple pieces of research around the whole area of microwave radiation, the ill effects of exposure by young children to Wi-Fi, for instance. What are the key pieces of research findings that you feel need to be highlighted?
Yeah, as a technologist, in a former incarnation, I was a satellite and microwave radio communications engineer. I was operating on the belief that the standards arrived at by the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers and other bodies were fit for purpose. And in discussing the digital education piece in 2015 at a conference with the Chief Risk Officer of a financial institution, he was a technologist himself. He pointed out, he was of the opinion that the real danger to the health and safety of kids in the classroom wasn't the digital technology itself per se, but the Wi-Fi that was increasingly being used at that time. And I shook my head in disbelief because I've been teaching my grandkids how to use technology, and they could switch on the Wi-Fi at home and do wonderful things. However, when I began to look at the scientific literature on this, I was appalled. It took me nearly 4 years to be confident enough to speak in public about it. It is a multidisciplinary body of research, which involves contributions from epidemiologists, professors of medicine, professors of physics and physics researchers, biology, chemistry. And so I began part of a group of independent international scientists focusing on this. And to cut a long story short, it does, and my expertise in risk ran the Ireland's Governance Risk and Compliance Technology Centre once upon a time. It does pose a risk to the health and well-being of children in the classroom and in the home, and that's been increasingly recognised by health authorities and governments across the developed world. And the concern is there, but as with climate change, as with smoking, as with just about everything else, which has a significant economic impact, not only for governments in terms of tax revenues and their digital strategies, but also industry. And we're talking about a multi-trillion-dollar industry where the business models of about every major corporation on the planet depends on digital technology. The last thing they want is for concerned scientists, of which there are thousands now, and a significant body of research up to, in terms of a very important biological condition called oxidative stress. 90% of the scientific studies find that exposure to wireless technology frequencies like Wi-Fi causes an increase in oxidative stress in the cells of humans, and in particular children. So if one were to adopt the precautionary approach in all this, classrooms would be wired, not wireless. And it is a significant issue because the way I look upon it is that the classroom should be a haven for children. Unfortunately, for most of them in the home, they're going to be exposed to this because of the role of wireless technology in modern life, and there's nothing we can do about that. I'm not saying we should go back to the dark ages, but we need to be risk aware, and we need to be especially aware of the risk to the children and to indeed fetuses in terms of their exposure at important junctures or stages in their physiological and neurological development, because the science is very clear in this. Exposure to weak fields of radio frequency radiation from wireless technologies does impact the central nervous system of developing children and also adults. And the mechanism through which it operates is oxidative stress. And as I said, 90% of studies on the relationship association between exposure to wireless radio frequency radiation such as Wi-Fi and biological responses in humans points to an adverse biological effect.
But
And that's unassailable.
That's fact, yeah. But so is it a case of capitalism trumping common sense? Are the findings, they're there, but are they being ignored?
I think, if we look at asbestos, and we all know it causes asbestosis and various forms of cancer, unfortunately, it's only a very small proportion of the population who would be exposed, publicly exposed, mainly occupationally exposed. And it took nearly 70 years even though the dangers were known at the end of the 19th century and the risks were known, and well into the early years of the 20th century, it wasn't until about 70 odd, 80 years where asbestos was banned effectively for use. And now a building that's being renovated, there's a big health and safety issue. Well, does it have asbestos? But you can look at many environmental toxins, and the same story is there. Business interest, the interest of industry, would fight tooth and nail. If the risks, the best way to explain this is we also have natural problems, the problems that health problems that occur naturally, are from a range of environmental toxins. The problem is these things already exist. So 5% increase or 1% increase from say 10% to 11% affecting the general population barely moves the needle, right? If it went from 0 to 1% or 5%, then it would be very noticeable, and there would be a cause for public action. But unfortunately, that's not the case here. But the truth, like everything else, the truth is there, and it will out eventually. And I suppose in 10, 20 years' time, we'll be looking back on this and shaking our heads in disbelief. I'm still alive in 20 years' time. I have colleagues in European, formerly of the European Environment Agency, and they wrote a very important series of papers and research monographs, late lessons from early warnings. And we have our early warnings here, for the last 20 years in terms of Wi-Fi. And, the consequences for society, because everybody's exposed, not just with asbestos or tobacco smoking, particular segments of the population, everybody's exposed now. So we're going to wait until one UK senior civil servant observed to a concerned scientist in the UK a couple of years ago. He said, before the government would do anything in this, you need the bodies to be piling up in the hospitals.
Wow.
And that's the official.
That's stark. And if you consider the pace of change these days, particularly with lockdown and COVID-19, etc., one wonders, has the horse bolted? Will it ever be halted? I mean, the asbestos problem pales in comparison in terms of magnitude.
Like the other physiological and psychological downsides of digital technology, particularly in education, we need to manage the risks, and this is the message I want to get out there. Right, we need to understand what the issues are. We need to manage the risks for our children and take informed decisions.